Just take a look around you for a second. The screen you're watching this on, the windows in your home, the very roads and cities we live in, they all share this one common and pretty much invisible ingredient. An ingredient so plentiful we literally named our deserts after it, and yet we are now somehow desperately running out of it. We're talking about sand. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds completely impossible, right? It's a paradox that just seems to defy common sense. On a planet with these vast, endless deserts, how could a sand shortage even be a real thing? Well, the answer to that question reveals a hidden and pretty unsettling truth about the foundation of our entire modern world. Alright, let's get into it and solve this mystery. The key lies in a simple but absolutely crucial detail about sand that most of us have never even thought about. And here it is, the big reveal. All that sand you picture in deserts like the Sahara, turns out it's almost completely useless for construction. Because when it comes to actually building our world, the type of sand is everything. If you were to look at them under a microscope, the difference is night and day. On the left, you've got desert sand. The wind has tumbled these grains for thousands of years, polishing them into these smooth, round little marbles. They just slide right past each other. But on the right, that's the good stuff. River and marine sand. It's been eroded by water, so its grains are all angular and sharp-edged. They walk together perfectly, and that's what creates the strong bonds we need for concrete, the literal glue that holds our modern world together. Okay, so now that we know we're after this specific angular sand, let's try to get our heads around the truly mind-boggling scale of our demand for it. And I mean, it is truly mind-boggling. Let's start small, with something we can all picture. A single, average family home. To build one, you need about 200 tons of sand. That's a lot, for sure, but trust me, we're just getting warmed up. Now let's zoom out to infrastructure. Just 1 kilometer of highway, that demands a staggering 30,000 tons of sand. Now think about the millions upon millions of kilometers of roads that crisscross our planet. Yeah, the numbers start to become almost impossible to comprehend. And if you need one statistic to really put this explosion in demand into perspective, here it is. The amount of construction the US did in an entire century, every dam, every bridge, every skyscraper, China surpassed that in just the last 2 decades. That rate of consumption is completely, utterly unprecedented in all of human history. But here's the thing, it's not just concrete. That screen you're looking at right now, it's made from melted down sand. The silicon chips that power our entire digital world, the fiber optic cables that are bringing you this very information, all from sand. We even use it to create brand new land out of the ocean. Countries like Singapore have literally expanded their nation's size by a quarter by dredging sand from the seafloor. So when you add it all up, we're pulling about 50 billion tons of sand and gravel from the Earth's rivers, coasts, and seabeds every single year. And honestly, that's probably a low estimate because so much of this extraction just happens off the books, completely unregulated. I mean, just let that sink in for a moment. Sand is the most used solid material on the planet. The only resource we consume more of is water. We use more sand than oil, more than coal, more than any other commodity that we think of as driving our world. Now, you can't have an appetite this insatiable without it coming at a cost. And it's a severe, often hidden cost that is paid by our environment and by communities all around the globe. See, when you dredge a riverbed, you're not just taking sand, you're ripping out the heart of an ecosystem. Riverbanks start to collapse, which can destabilize bridges. Along the coasts, when you remove sand, you erase the natural barriers that protect communities from storm surges. The sediment that gets kicked up drifts for miles, smothering and killing vibrant coral reefs. And in the most extreme cases, entire islands, particularly in nations like Indonesia, have been mined so aggressively that they have literally just vanished from the map. And, wherever you find massive demand and weak regulation, a dangerous and violent criminal underworld almost always emerges to control such a vital resource. They are known, quite simply, as the sand mafias. These are powerful, organized crime syndicates that run a multi-billion-dollar illegal trade in sand, and they often use extreme violence and intimidation to control their territory and silence anyone who gets in their way. And the economics behind it are just brutally simple and incredibly lucrative. A truckload of illegally mined sand might cost about $30 to extract, but in a booming city, that same truckload can sell for $200. With profit margins that are up there with the drug trade, it's really no surprise this has become such a violent and widespread enterprise. So as bad as this whole situation is right now, maybe the most alarming part is that it is on track to get dramatically worse. This crisis is accelerating. Just think about this for a second. Back in 1950, less than a third of all humans lived in cities. Today, it's over half of us. And by 2050, it's projected that 2/3 of all people on Earth will be urban dwellers. That's another 2.5 billion people who are going to need homes and offices and roads and all the infrastructure that goes with it. All of it built with sand. And this right here, this is the fundamental, unavoidable problem. The sand we rely on was created over geological time. We're talking millions of years of rocks being ground down by glaciers and rivers. And yet, we're consuming those millions of years of work on a timescale of mere decades. The math simply doesn't add up. The rivers cannot replenish the sand fast enough. The coastal reserves are being stripped bare. We are, quite literally, liquidating a finite natural inheritance in a single, frantic burst of global construction. Our entire civilization is this magnificent, complex structure, but it's built on a foundation we have always taken for granted. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what happens when that very foundation starts to wash away? Sand, it seems so humble, infinite, just an ordinary part of the background, but it's actually the hidden foundation of our entire modern world. And believe it or not, we are facing a crisis that most of us don't even know exists. Okay, let's really get into this. Think about every skyscraper, every bridge, every single road you've ever driven on. They're all built with concrete. And what's the most critical, irreplaceable ingredient in all that concrete? It's sand. It is quite literally the bedrock of our civilization. And it doesn't stop there, not by a long shot. Just look at any city skyline. What you're seeing are countless tons of sand that have been melted down at insane temperatures and totally transformed into the glass that defines modern architecture. Right, and get this, even the device you're watching this on right now, it only exists because of sand. It's the source of the high-purity silicon that forms the microscopic heart of every single computer chip. So sand didn't just build our cities, it literally built our digital future. But we're extracting this resource at a pace that it completely dwarfs nature's ability to replenish it. This incredible usefulness comes with a hidden price tag, one that we are only now just beginning to calculate. So the first thing you have to understand is that sand isn't just a simple local material anymore. That whole idea that you just build with whatever sand is nearby, that belongs to a totally different era, a bygone era. See, nations are waking up to a pretty sobering fact. They've been selling off a finite, strategic national asset. Countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, they've slammed on the brakes, imposing strict regulations or even outright bans on sand exports. They've realized that once their sand is gone, well, it's gone for good. And this is creating a massive shift in global power. This completely reframes how we have to think about global development. Huge projects, from China's continent-spanning Belt and Road Initiative to the explosive growth of Africa's megacities, they all depend on frankly incomprehensible amounts of sand. So if you control the supply, you suddenly hold some serious leverage over the future of global infrastructure. Now this new geopolitical pressure, this manufactured scarcity, it creates a vacuum. And you know what happens when legal trade gets choked off, right? A shadow economy, ruthless and incredibly efficient, rushes in to fill the void. Make no mistake, the illegal sand trade is a vast global machine. It operates with stunning sophistication. We're talking networks of informants, dredging entire rivers and coastlines under the cover of darkness, constantly changing routes to evade the authorities. This isn't some small-time petty theft. This is highly organized crime on a global scale. And that's the crucial point, the sheer scale of these operations. We're talking about industrial-sized dredging and mining, and it's often protected by deep-seated corruption, operating with total impunity where governments are weak. They are literally stealing entire landscapes. The economic and criminal fallout is just staggering, but even that is dwarfed by the environmental cost. We are racking up an ecological debt that will be incredibly, maybe even impossibly, difficult to repay. And here's the really bitter irony. We take sand to build and protect our cities, but in the process, we destroy their most vital natural defenses. We're removing the very beaches and sandbars that have evolved over millennia specifically to absorb storm surges and protect coastal communities. all while our climate is getting more and more volatile. And the consequences? They are measurable and they are shocking. In the last 80 years, the Mississippi Delta has lost nearly 5,000 square kilometers of land. To put that in perspective, that's an area larger than the state of Rhode Island, just gone. It's vanishing because of something called sediment disruption. Basically, dams way upstream trap the sand that would normally flow down and replenish the delta, while at the same time, mining operations scoop up what little is left. The delta is being starved. And this kicks off a cascade of disaster for the 500 million people who live on river deltas around the world. As the sand is removed and sediment gets trapped, the deltas sink and compact. Salt water from the ocean pushes further and further inland, poisoning freshwater aquifers and rendering some of the most fertile agricultural land on the planet completely useless. But this story, it isn't without hope. The sheer scale of this crisis is actually forcing innovation. All over the world, engineers, architects, and scientists are pioneering what you might call an architecture of restraint, and they're developing some truly incredible solutions. You know, maybe the most straightforward solution is just turning our old cities into the quarries for our new ones. When old buildings are demolished, we can actually crush that old concrete and use the material, it's called recycled aggregate, to replace virgin sand in new construction. In fact, some estimates suggest that this recycled aggregate could replace up to 30% of our total demand for natural sand. The main challenge isn't the technology, it's just economics and old habits. Right now, in a lot of places, it's still cheaper to just go dredge a riverbed illegally than it is to invest in the infrastructure for recycling. And beyond recycling, some people are asking an even more fundamental question: do we even need so much sand-based concrete at all? We're seeing the rise of mass timber skyscrapers, building materials literally grown from mycelium, that's the root network of fungi, concrete alternatives made from hemp, and even large-scale 3D printing that can create incredible structures while using way less material. Ultimately, this gets to the very heart of the matter. We aren't running out of sand in the literal sense. I mean, the world's deserts have more than we could ever use. No, what we're running out of is balance. We extract up to 50 billion tons of sand and gravel every single year. After water, it is the most consumed natural resource on the entire planet. The scale of it is it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Now compare that industrial scale extraction with nature's replenishment rate. Every single one of those billions of tons of sand is the end product of thousands, sometimes millions of years of geology, of rock eroding and tumbling down rivers. We are consuming a geological inheritance in the span of a single human lifetime. And here's the most important point. We are not facing a crisis of capability. We know how to solve this. The technologies are already here, or they're emerging fast. The policies can be written. The only thing we truly lack is the collective will to recognize the true cost of sand and actually act on the solutions we already have in our hands. For centuries, we built our worlds on a resource we treated as if it were infinite, when in fact, it's irreplaceable. So the defining question for us now is whether we can build the next century not just from what we can take, but from what we choose to value and preserve. The choice? Well, the choice is ours.